Hello there, and welcome. I'm glad you found your way here. Maybe the day has been long. Maybe the room is finally quiet. Or maybe your mind is still awake, drifting through old questions that do not need quick answers. Tonight, we're going to move slowly through one of the strangest ideas humans have carried with them for thousands of years: the mystery of giants. Not just giants as monsters from old stories, and not just giants as something to prove or dismiss, but giants as a shape that appears again and again in human imagination, in sacred texts, mountain legends, old poems, island folklore, ruined places, enormous bones, and strange landscapes that seem to ask for an explanation. For a very long time, people looked at the world around them and felt the presence of something larger. Huge stones resting in impossible places, cliffs that looked almost like sleeping bodies, bones too large to easily understand, storms that seemed alive, mountains rising in the distance like the backs of buried beings. And from those impressions, stories began to grow. Some of these stories were religious, some were mythological, some were warnings, some were explanations, and some may have been a way of giving shape to a feeling humans have always known: that the world before us was older, stranger, and perhaps larger than the one we understand today. So tonight, there is nothing you need to solve. You do not need to remember every name, every place, or every tradition. You can simply listen for as long as you like. Let the details pass by softly. Let the edges blur a little. And if sleep finds you somewhere along the way, then that is perfectly all right. The mystery will still be here. We'll begin with the widest question first. Why did so many people, in so many different places, imagine giants? And why, after all this time, do they still feel so difficult to let go? Long before modern science, modern maps, or museum labels, people in distant parts of the world told stories of beings much larger than ordinary humans. They appeared in sacred writings, mountain legends, island folklore, ancient poems, and quiet fireside tales passed from one generation to the next. Some lived beyond the sea. Some waited in the mountains. Some came before kings, before cities, before the world felt fully measured and known. Sometimes they were violent. Sometimes they were wise. Sometimes they built walls, shaped landscapes, fought divine powers, guarded hidden places, or disappeared into the far edges of memory. In one place, a giant might be a dangerous enemy. In another, a builder. In another, an ancestor. In another, a warning about the wild places beyond the safety of human life. What makes giants so interesting is not only that people imagined them, but that they imagined them again and again. The names changed. The landscapes changed. The beliefs changed. But the basic image remained. A human-like figure made enormous, standing somewhere between memory and myth. Perhaps giants gave shape to a feeling older than history itself. The feeling that the world was once bigger than it is now, heavier, stranger, and not yet fully explained. And perhaps, for people living long before satellites, excavations, weather maps, and geological timelines, the world really did feel larger than it feels to us now. A mountain was not just a mountain. It was a wall of stone rising into the clouds, older than memory, impossible to move, and sometimes impossible to cross. A storm was not just weather passing through the sky. It was a voice above the village, shaking roofs, bending trees, and filling the dark with power. A canyon, a cave, a cliff, or a field of standing stones could seem to carry intention, as if the land itself had once been touched by something enormous. When people met things too large for ordinary explanation, they often imagined beings large enough to match them. Giants became a way to understand scale. They gave a human shape to mountains, storms, ruins, and bones. In that sense, a giant was not only a creature. It was a way of saying that the world itself was vast, alive, and still only partly understood. And sometimes, the mystery was not only in mountains or storms, but in the ground itself. Long before paleontology gave names to extinct animals, people sometimes found enormous bones buried in riverbanks, caves, fields, and cliffs. A single tooth could be larger than anything they had seen in a living creature. A curved tusk could look like part of some buried monster. A skull, broken by time and earth, could seem almost human if seen in the right shadow. To us, these remains might belong to mammoths, elephants, whales, dinosaurs, or other animals from deep prehistory. But to people without that framework, they were signs from an older world. Proof, or something very close to proof, that enormous beings had once walked where ordinary people now stood. This does not mean every giant story began with a fossil, but bones gave imagination something solid to touch. A story spoken beside a fire is one thing. A huge bone lifted from the earth is something heavier. It can make the past feel close enough to hold. And in some traditions, giants were not only found in the earth or imagined in the shape of mountains. They were written into sacred memory. Among the most famous giant-like figures are the Nephilim. They appear briefly in the Hebrew Bible, in passages that have been discussed, translated, and interpreted in many different ways. Later writings, especially the first book of Enoch, expanded their story and described them as giants born from a strange crossing between heavenly beings and human women. That is part of what makes the Nephilim so powerful as an idea. They do not belong neatly to one world. They seem to stand between heaven and earth, between human ancestry and divine mystery, between old violence and old wonder. Some traditions treated them as literal giants. Others understood them as mighty warriors, fallen beings, corrupted bloodlines, or symbols of a world that had become too violent before judgment. But however they are interpreted, the Nephilim gave giants something more than size. They gave them a sacred shadow, a feeling that the mystery of giants reached upward as well as backward. And far from the world of biblical tradition, the Greeks also imagined enormous beings standing close to the beginning of existence. In Greek mythology, giant-like figures often belonged to the deep, early layers of the world. Before the familiar stories of temples, heroes, and city-states, there were older powers. Titans, cyclopes, gigantes, and other beings connected with earth, sky, fire, thunder, and the restless forces beneath mountains. They were not always giants in the simple sense of very tall people. Some were divine, some were monstrous, some were ancient craftsmen, some were enemies of the gods, but all of them carried the feeling of a world before the world became orderly. The Cyclopes, for example, were remembered as one-eyed giants. In one tradition, they were not only frightening cave dwellers, but smiths who forged the thunderbolts of Zeus. That detail matters. It means giants were not only destroyers. Sometimes they were makers of power itself. In the Greek imagination, giants belonged to an older, rougher reality. A world still being shaped, still burning, still echoing beneath the polished marble of later myths. Far to the north, in the old stories of the Norse world, giants were also part of the deep beginning. They were often called Jötnar, and they were not simply large enemies waiting to be defeated. They were older, stranger, and more complicated than that. They lived beyond the settled world, in places associated with wilderness, cold, darkness, mountains, and the forces that human beings could never fully control. Some were dangerous, some were wise, some were beautiful, some were related to the gods themselves. In Norse myth, the boundary between god and giant was not always clean. The two worlds fought, traded, married, tricked one another, and sometimes seemed to reflect each other like shapes seen through ice. The first being, Ymir, was a giant-like figure. From his body, the world itself was made. His flesh became the earth, his blood became the sea, his bones became the mountains, and his skull became the sky. Here, the giant does not only walk through the world, the giant becomes the world. And perhaps that is why giants so often lived far away from ordinary life. Across many traditions, they were not usually placed in the center of the village or beside the familiar roads people walked every day. They lived at the edges, beyond the mountains, across the sea, in the far north, in deep forests, on remote islands, under volcanoes, inside caves, in deserts, cliffs, and borderlands where the human world began to fade. Those places mattered. The edge of the known world has always been where imagination grows strongest. When people did not know what waited beyond a ridge, a dark tree line, or a distant shore, the unknown became easier to fill with beings large enough to match it. A giant was too large for the ordinary village, too old for the present day, too wild for the safety of the fire. So giants belonged where certainty ended. They stood at the border between what humans knew and what they could only imagine. Many giant legends are connected to stones. Massive stones, old walls, strange ruins, lonely towers, and natural formations often inspired stories about enormous builders. The logic is easy to understand. When people found something too large, too heavy, or too strangely placed to explain, they imagined hands large enough to have moved it there. A stone circle could become the work of giants. A huge causeway of rock could become the remains of a giant's path. A mountain ridge might be described as something thrown, broken, or shaped by enormous strength. Even a single boulder, sitting alone in a field, could invite the question of who carried it, who dropped it, and why. Modern archaeology and geology can often explain these places with careful detail. But the older stories still reveal something important. Human beings look for intention in scale. We see the huge and ask who made it, and when ordinary hands seem too small for the answer, the mind begins to imagine larger ones. Not every giant story needed to begin in pure imagination. Human height varies, and in rare cases, some people grow far beyond ordinary size because of medical conditions that affect growth. To us, this belongs to biology. But in older communities, where most people were shorter than modern averages, and where medical explanations were limited, an unusually tall person could seem almost otherworldly. A very tall warrior, king, traveler, or enemy might be remembered for generations. And memory has a way of stretching what it keeps. A tall man becomes enormous. An enormous man becomes giant. A battlefield story becomes a legend. A legend becomes part of the land. This does not mean that mythical giants were simply tall humans. The stories are usually much larger than that. But real height gave people a living example of how far the human body could seem to reach. Sometimes myth begins with wonder, standing directly in front of you. There is a strange feeling that appears in many old stories. The sense that the past was bigger. The people were stronger. The animals were larger. The forests were deeper. The gods were closer. The stones were heavier. The The world itself seemed more alive, less measured, less familiar, and less safely explained. Giants fit perfectly into this feeling. They are not only beings of size, they are beings of before the present age, before ordinary humans became the center of the story, before the world was mapped, named, divided, and made smaller by understanding. This is why giants often appear as remnants of an earlier time. They are survivors, ancestors, enemies, builders, or ghosts of a world that has mostly vanished. They feel like something left behind from a heavier age, when the earth still carried old powers close to the surface. Maybe that is why the idea remains so powerful. Giants give form to the suspicion that something immense came before us, and that the world we know is only the latest, smaller layer resting above it. When we say giant, it sounds like we are talking about one kind of creature. But across mythology and folklore, the word covers many different beings. Some giants are simply very large humans. Some are divine beings. Some are monsters. Some are ancestors. Some are forces of nature given a body. Some are old races pushed aside by gods, heroes, or newer peoples. Some are builders. Some are destroyers. Some are almost gentle, while others belong to chaos and fear. This is important because the mystery of giants is not one single question. It is a family of questions. Why did people imagine huge, human-like forms? Why did they place them in the past or far away, or beneath mountains, or beyond the sea? Why did they connect them with bones, stones, storms, ruins, and the edges of the world? The giant is less like one creature and more like a shape that many cultures filled with their own fears, memories, landscapes, and questions. One reason giants feel so powerful is that they are almost human. They have faces, hands, bodies, hunger, anger, pride, loneliness, families, and sometimes even grief. They can speak, they can build, they can fight, they can be tricked, they can fall in love. They can sleep beneath mountains, walk through storms, or leave footprints where no ordinary person could have passed. But they are also not fully human. Their size pushes them beyond ordinary life. A human body made enormous becomes something strange, familiar enough to recognize, but too large to trust, close enough to understand, but distant enough to fear. That may be why giants feel different from dragons, sea monsters, or spirits. A dragon is clearly other. A giant is close to us. It is our own shape, stretched into the scale of cliffs, forests, and weather. And maybe that closeness is what makes them linger. A giant is humanity seen through the mirror of the impossible. Many giant stories are frightening, but not always in the sharp, sudden way that horror is frightening. They are frightening because they make human beings feel small. A giant can step over a wall, break a house, move a stone, carry away animals, or stand above a battlefield like a living tower. Against such a figure, ordinary strength means very little. Spears, doors, fences, and courage all begin to feel fragile. In older societies where survival depended on weather, harvests, animals, war, and luck, the idea of overwhelming force was never abstract. People knew what it meant to be powerless before something larger than themselves. A storm could ruin a village. A flood could erase a field. A mountain could fall. An enemy could appear beyond the ridge. Giants gave that feeling a body. They became the shape of danger when danger was too large to hold in one thought. Fear, when made human-shaped, becomes easier to remember, easier to warn about, and easier to carry as a story. Not all giants were enemies. In some stories, giant figures protect places, guard treasures, watch over landscapes, or stand as old powers connected to the land itself. They may be dangerous to outsiders, but not meaningless. They belong somewhere. They keep a border. They remember an older order. This is one reason giants can feel strangely comforting as well as frightening. A giant can destroy, but a giant can also shelter. A being large enough to crush a village is also large enough to shield one. The same huge hand that could tear up trees could also hold back the dark, or guard a valley, or sleep quietly beneath a hill while generations pass above. That double feeling is important. The giant is not only a monster, the giant is a presence, a symbol of size, age, memory, and protection. Sometimes myth begins with wonder standing directly in front of you. There is a strange feeling that appears in many old stories, the sense that the past was bigger, the people were stronger, the animals were larger, the forests were deeper, the gods were closer, the stones were heavier. The world itself seemed more alive, less measured, less familiar, and less safely explained. Giants fit perfectly into this feeling. They are not only beings of size, they are beings of before the present age, before ordinary humans became the center of the story, before the world was mapped, named, divided, and made smaller by understanding. This is why giants often appear as remnants of an earlier time. They are survivors, ancestors, enemies, builders, or ghosts of a world that has mostly vanished. They feel like something left behind from a heavier age, when the earth still carried old powers close to the surface. Maybe that is why the idea remains so powerful. Giants give form to the suspicion that something immense came before us, and that the world we know is only the latest, smaller layer resting above it. When we say giant, it sounds like we are talking about one kind of creature. But across mythology and folklore, the word covers many different beings. Some giants are simply very large humans. Some are divine beings. Some are monsters. Some are ancestors. Some are forces of nature given a body. Some are old races pushed aside by gods, heroes, or newer peoples. Some are builders. Some are destroyers. Some are almost gentle, while others belong to chaos and fear. This is important because the mystery of giants is not one single question. It is a family of questions. Why did people imagine huge human-like forms? Why did they place them in the past or far away, or beneath mountains, or beyond the sea? Why did they connect them with bones, stones, storms, ruins, and the edges of the world? The giant is less like one creature and more like a shape that many cultures filled with their own fears, memories, landscapes, and questions. One reason giants feel so powerful is that they are almost human. They have faces, hands, bodies, hunger, anger, pride, loneliness, families, and sometimes even grief. They can speak, they can build, they can fight, they can be tricked, they can fall in love. They can sleep beneath mountains, walk through storms, or leave footprints where no ordinary person could have passed. But they are also not fully human. Their size pushes them beyond ordinary life. A human body made enormous becomes something strange, familiar enough to recognize, but too large to trust. Close enough to understand, but distant enough to fear. That may be why giants feel different from dragons, sea monsters, or spirits. A dragon is clearly other. A giant is close to us. It is our own shape, stretched into the scale of cliffs, forests, and weather. And maybe that closeness is what makes them linger. A giant is humanity seen through the mirror of the impossible. Many giant stories are frightening, but not always in the sharp, sudden way that horror is frightening. They are frightening because they make human beings feel small. A giant can step over a wall, break a house, move a stone, carry away animals, or stand above a battlefield like a living tower. Against such a figure, ordinary strength means very little. Spears, doors, fences, and courage all begin to feel fragile. In older societies, where survival depended on weather, harvests, animals, war, and luck, the idea of overwhelming force was never abstract. People knew what it meant to be powerless before something larger than themselves. A storm could ruin a village. A flood could erase a field. A mountain could fall. An enemy could appear beyond the ridge. Giants gave that feeling a body. They became the shape of danger when danger was too large to hold in one thought. Fear, when made human-shaped, becomes easier to remember, easier to warn about, and easier to carry as a story. Not all giants were enemies. In some stories, giant figures protect places, guard treasures, watch over landscapes, or stand as old powers connected to the land itself. They may be dangerous to outsiders, but not meaningless. They belong somewhere. They keep a border. They remember an older order. This is one reason giants can feel strangely comforting as well as frightening. A giant can destroy, but a giant can also shelter. A being large enough to crush a village is also large enough to shield one. The same huge hand that could tear up trees could also hold back the dark, or guard a valley, or sleep quietly beneath a hill while generations pass above. That double feeling is important. The giant is not only a monster, the giant is a presence, a symbol of size, age, memory, and protection. In the Enochic tradition, the giants are not remembered as peaceful beings. They are described as violent, hungry, and destructive. Their appetite grows beyond what the earth can bear. They consume, fight, and bring suffering into the world around them. In this version of the story, size becomes more than height. It becomes excess. Too much hunger, too much power, too much force in a world too fragile to hold it. That may be one reason these stories had such a lasting effect. Giants became a way to imagine what happens when strength is no longer guided by wisdom. A giant body without restraint becomes a danger not only to people, but to the order of life itself. And yet, even here, the story is not only about monsters. It is about imbalance. The giant becomes a warning that when desire grows larger than the world around it, everything begins to break beneath its weight. The Anakim appear in biblical tradition as a people of great size, remembered with fear by those who heard of them. They belong to the landscape of Canaan, a land filled with promise, danger, memory, and uncertainty. To later readers, the Anakim became part of the wider family of giant traditions, connected with the feeling that some peoples of the ancient world seemed almost impossibly large and powerful. Whether we read these descriptions literally, symbolically, or as the language of fear, they carry a strong emotional truth. To approach an unknown land and hear that enormous people live there is to feel small before the future. It is to imagine the land itself as guarded by bodies too large to defeat. The Anakim show how giant stories could attach themselves not only to old myths, but to real human fears. Fear of conquest, fear of strangers, fear of entering a place where others already seem stronger. Sometimes a giant is not found in the mountains, but in the mind before a difficult journey. One of the most memorable moments connected with giant peoples is the report of the spies sent into Canaan. According to the story, they return with fear in their voices. The land is rich, but the people are strong. The cities are fortified, and among those people are descendants of giant-like figures. The spies describe themselves as feeling like grasshoppers in comparison. That image is simple but unforgettable. To feel like a grasshopper is not only to see someone larger than you, it is to feel your own courage shrink. It is to stand before the unknown and imagine yourself already defeated. Whether the report was literal description, fearful exaggeration, or both, the emotional power is clear. The giant here becomes a measure of human fear, a way of saying that the obstacle ahead felt too large for ordinary strength. And, in that sense, the real giant may have been the land itself, waiting beyond the horizon. Og of Bashan became one of the great images of the giant king. In biblical tradition, he is remembered as a powerful ruler connected with the Rephaim, another ancient group often associated with great size and old strength. His bed, or resting place, is described with enormous dimensions, and that detail gave later imagination something vivid to hold on to. A giant king is different from a wild giant in the mountains. He is not only large, he is organized power. A throne, a kingdom, a bed of great size, a memory preserved in measurement. Through Og, the giant becomes political as well as physical. He represents a ruler whose presence is felt through land, fear, and scale. Whether the details are read historically, symbolically, or as ancient heroic language, the image remains striking. Some giants wander, some giants guard borders. But Og sits in memory like a king from an older, heavier world. Goliath is perhaps the most familiar warrior giant in the Western imagination. He appears not as a vague being from the edge of the world, but as a champion standing before an army. His size matters, but so does his role. He is the one who steps forward when others hesitate. He becomes the body of intimidation, the visible shape of an enemy that seems too strong to face. That is why the story has lasted so well. It is not only about height, it is about the moment when fear becomes concentrated into one figure. An entire army can look at one warrior and feel its own strength disappear. And then, against that enormous image, the story places someone smaller. David does not defeat only a man, he defeats the feeling that size is destiny. In that way, Goliath became more than a warrior. He became a symbol of the giant we measure ourselves against whenever something looks too large to overcome. In sacred traditions, giants often belong to a world that has become unstable. They appear near stories of violence, corruption, pride, forbidden unions, and judgment. Their size is not always treated as wonder alone. Sometimes it becomes a sign that the old order has swollen beyond its proper limits. Bodies grow too large. Appetites grow too large. Power grows too large, and the world begins to bend beneath the weight of it. That is one reason giant stories could carry moral meaning. A giant was not only a strange being from the past. A giant could be a warning about excess, about strength without restraint, about what happens when the boundaries between worlds are crossed too carelessly. This gives sacred giant stories their heavy atmosphere. They do not feel like simple adventures. They feel like memories of a world before correction. A world where something had grown enormous and something else had to answer. Sacred giant stories survived for so long because they carried more than curiosity. They gave people a way to speak about fear, power, pride, ancestry, violence, and the unknown in one image. A giant could be a body, but also a lesson. A reminder that strength can become dangerous when it is separated from wisdom. A reminder that old worlds can leave traces. a reminder that human beings have always wondered what came before them. These stories also survived because they were never fully closed. The ancient texts often leave space around the giants. They do not explain every detail. They do not answer every question. They give only glimpses, names, measurements, rumors, and strange encounters. And that emptiness kept the imagination alive. A fully explained creature can be placed neatly on a shelf, but a giant half seen in sacred memory remains difficult to put away. It keeps standing there, somewhere between belief, symbol, and dream. Before the Olympian gods ruled the Greek imagination, there were the Titans. They were not always giants in the simple storybook sense, but they were vast, older powers. They belonged to an earlier generation of divine beings, close to the beginning of the world, when sky, earth, sea, time, and force still felt like living presences. The Titans make the past feel layered. They remind us that even the gods had ancestors. Even divine order had something rougher before it. Cronus, Oceanus, Hyperion, Rhea, and the others stand in that older space before Zeus in Olympus fully rose into power. This is part of what makes them feel giant-like. They are not only large in body, they are large in age, in meaning, in the weight they carry inside the story. The Titans are the feeling that behind every ordered world, there may be another world beneath it. Older, darker, slower, and not entirely gone. The Gigantes, or giants of Greek mythology, were remembered through a great struggle against the gods. Their war with the Olympians, often called the Gigantomachy, was not simply a battle between large bodies and divine weapons. It was a mythic image of disorder rising against order, earthborn power challenging the rule of heaven. In many ancient artworks, the Gigantes appear as enormous figures locked in combat with gods. Some are human-shaped, some are shown with serpent-like legs. Their forms seem to belong partly to the earth and partly to something stranger. They are powerful, but also unstable, as if the ground itself has risen up in anger. This made them different from ordinary enemies. They were not just warriors on a battlefield. They were cosmic resistance given bodies. And perhaps that is why the image lasted. The war of gods and giants turned an old human feeling into myth. The sense that order is never guaranteed, and that beneath every calm world, older forces may still be stirring. The Cyclopes are among the strangest giant figures in Greek mythology. They are remembered as one-eyed beings, enormous and powerful, but not all the stories treat them in the same way. In some traditions, they are wild and dangerous. In others, they are ancient craftsmen connected with divine power. They forge thunderbolts, shape impossible weapons, and seem to belong to the fiery workshop of the early world. A single eye makes them feel especially mysterious. A giant with two eyes is simply a human form made larger. But a giant with one eye becomes something more distant from us, more symbolic, more dreamlike. It is almost human, but shifted just enough to feel ancient and strange. Perhaps that is why the Cyclopes stayed in memory. They were not only large, they were altered. A familiar body marked by one impossible difference. And sometimes, one difference is enough to turn a giant into a myth that survives for thousands of years. Polyphemus is the Cyclops many people remember most clearly. In the Odyssey, he lives in a cave, far from ordinary human law, keeping sheep and existing outside the world of cities, ships, and hospitality. When Odysseus and his men enter his cave, they do not simply meet a large creature. They meet a being who lives at the edge of civilization itself. Polyphemus is frightening, because he is both familiar and wild. He has a home, animals, food, and a voice. But he does not follow the rules that humans depend on. He does not welcome strangers as guests. He traps them, consumes them, and turns the cave into a place of helplessness. In that story, the giant is not only a body of great size. He is the fear of being caught far from home, beyond protection, beyond custom, beyond anyone who can hear you. The cave becomes the world reduced to darkness, stone, and breath. One possible explanation for Cyclops' stories begins not with monsters, but with bones. On Mediterranean islands and in ancient landscapes, people could have encountered the skulls of extinct dwarf elephants or other large animals. An elephant skull has a large central nasal opening where the trunk once attached. To someone unfamiliar with elephant anatomy, especially if the skull was broken or weathered, that opening might look like a single enormous eye socket. This idea does not prove where the Cyclops myth came from. Myths rarely have one clean origin, but it gives us a fascinating glimpse into how ancient imagination may have worked. A strange skull is found in the earth. It looks almost like a face. It is too large for an ordinary human. And slowly, the mind begins to build a body around it. The bone becomes a clue. The clue becomes a creature. And the creature, once spoken aloud, becomes almost impossible to forget. Some Greek giant figures went beyond even the shape of enlarged humanity. The Hekatonchires, whose name means something like hundred-handed ones, were beings of overwhelming form. They were not simply tall or strong. They had many arms, many hands, and a scale that pushed them into the realm of the almost unimaginable. Figures like these show that giant myths were not only about height, they were about excess. Too much body, too much strength, too much power for the ordinary world to contain. 100 hands is not just a physical detail. It is an image of force multiplied beyond human limits. In stories of the early cosmos, such beings belonged to a time before order had fully settled. The world was still crowded with shapes that did not fit neatly into later categories. And perhaps that is what makes them so haunting. They feel like forms from a dream of creation, before nature had decided what a body should be. Many ancient giant stories seem to sink downward into the earth itself. In Greek and other Mediterranean traditions, enormous beings were sometimes imagined beneath mountains, islands, or volcanoes. Their struggles, punishments, or restless movements could be used to explain the shaking of the ground, the fire beneath the earth, or the smoke rising from distant peaks. A volcano is already a giant-like thing. It sleeps for years, sometimes centuries, and then suddenly breathes fire. It reshapes land. It darkens the sky. It reminds people that the ground beneath their feet is not as still as it seems, so it is not surprising that older imaginations placed giant bodies below such places. A buried giant gave the mountain a hidden life. It made eruptions and tremors feel like the signs of something vast turning in its sleep. The earth itself became a body, and the volcano became its breath. In Greek mythology, giants often carried the feeling of chaos and old power. They were not always chaotic in a simple way, as if they were only wild or stupid. Their chaos was deeper than that. They belonged to forces that existed before the world had settled into order. They were connected with earth, fire, storms, mountains, and the heavy movements beneath the surface of things. When gods fought giants, the stories were often about more than victory in battle. They were about the fragile shape of order itself. The gods represented a world arranged into names, laws, temples, seasons, and authority. The giants represented what came before that arrangement, or what might rise again if it ever failed. That is why they feel so old. They are not just enemies standing in front of the gods. They are reminders of the roughness beneath creation. The giant is the memory of a world not yet fully tamed. In the Norse imagination, the story of giants begins with Ymir. Ymir was not simply one giant among others. He was the first being, a vast figure formed in the strange emptiness before the familiar world. From him came other beings, and from his body, the world itself was made. His flesh became the earth. His blood became the sea. His bones became mountains. His teeth and broken fragments became stones. His skull became the sky, raised above the world like a great dome. Even the clouds were imagined from part of him. It is one of the most enormous ideas in mythology. The land is not merely land. The sea is not merely water. The sky is not merely distance. They are the remains of something alive, something too vast to stay in one shape. In this story, the giant does not vanish. He becomes everything beneath our feet and above our heads. The Jotnar of Norse myth often lived outside the ordered world of gods and humans. They belonged to wild places, mountains, deep forests, icy lands, dark coastlines, and the far edges of the known world. They were not always evil, but they were rarely safe. They represented what lay beyond the walls, beyond the firelight, beyond the fields people could cultivate and defend. This is what makes them feel so different from simple monsters. A monster can be killed, and the story can end. But wilderness cannot be killed. Winter cannot be defeated forever. The sea cannot be conquered completely. The unknown always waits beyond the last house. The Jotnar gave a face and a body to that outer world. They were beings of distance, weather, hunger, stone, and old memory. To speak of giants was, in a way, to speak of everything human order could not fully control. Frost giants carry one of the clearest fears in northern imagination, the fear of winter. In lands where cold could decide survival, winter was not only a season, it was a power. It could close roads, kill animals, bury homes, freeze water, and turn familiar landscapes into blank white distances. To imagine that cold as a giant was not childish, it was deeply understandable. A frost giant is winter made almost human, huge, pale, distant, and difficult to bargain with. It does not need to hate you to be dangerous, it only needs to arrive. This gives frost giant stories a quiet seriousness. They are not merely about battles in frozen worlds. They are about the experience of living where nature could become larger than human plans. Where warmth was precious, shelter mattered, and the dark months seemed to belong to older forces. The frost giant is the shape of cold, when cold becomes a presence. Giantesses in Norse myth are some of the most interesting figures in the giant tradition. They are not only background characters or female versions of male giants. Many are powerful, wise, dangerous, beautiful, prophetic, or deeply connected to fate. Some are mothers of gods or monsters. Some possess knowledge that even divine beings seek. Some stand at the edges of stories like figures who understand more than they say. Their presence complicates the idea of giants as simple enemies. Through giantesses, the world of the Jotnar becomes intimate, ancestral, and mysterious. The gods do not merely fight giants. They marry them, desire them, learn from them, and are sometimes born from them. This makes the boundary between god and giant feel much thinner. The wild world is not outside creation. It is woven into it. A giantess can be a threat, a mother, a teacher, or a prophecy waiting in human shape. And in that quiet uncertainty, the giant world becomes deeper. The relationship between giants and gods in Norse mythology is never simple. They fight each other, but they also resemble each other. They are enemies, but also relatives. Some gods have giant ancestry. Some marry giantesses. Some seek wisdom from giant beings who seem older than the divine order itself. This makes the conflict feel less like a battle between good and evil, and more like a struggle between two connected worlds. The gods represent order, halls, laws, names, and protection. The giants represent wilderness, distance, raw nature, old knowledge, and the forces that existed before things were neatly arranged. But they need each other. Without the giants, the gods would have no boundary to guard, no mystery to answer, no older power to define themselves against. And without the gods, the giants would be only wilderness without contrast. They are mirrors across a dark valley, each one showing the other what it is and what it fears becoming. Asgard, the home of the Norse gods, was imagined as a place of order. It had halls, walls, feasts, names, duties, and divine families. It was not necessarily gentle, but it was structured. It was a world where things had their place. Beyond it, however, stretched the less certain realms, places where the Jötnar lived, where cold, stone, darkness, and old forces gathered. The idea of giants beyond the walls is powerful because every human settlement has known that feeling. Inside the walls, there is fire, language, family, and memory. Outside, there is weather, hunger, distance, and the unknown. The giants beyond Asgard are not only beings in a myth. They are the feeling of what waits outside protection, the thing that cannot be invited in too easily, but also cannot be erased. Every wall creates an outside, and in Norse myth, that outside had giant footsteps. Norse giants feel ancient because they often seem to belong to a time before moral categories became clear. They are not simply evil creatures hiding in the dark. They are older powers. They are frost, stone, sea, mountain, hunger, prophecy, and wild intelligence. Some are cruel, some are generous, some are dangerous because they are hostile. Others are dangerous simply because they are too large, too old, or too close to the forces that made the world. That is what gives them weight. They do not feel like villains invented only to be defeated. They feel like the remains of a rougher reality, one that the gods must negotiate with, battle, marry into, learn from, and eventually face again at the end of things. A purely evil monster can be destroyed and forgotten, but an ancient giant cannot be dismissed so easily. It belongs to the foundation stones of the story, and foundations do not disappear just because a hall is built above them. Across Celtic and British landscapes, giant stories often cling to the land itself. They appear around cliffs, hills, standing stones, lonely islands, old roads, and strange rock formations. In these traditions, the giant is often less like a creature passing through a story, and more like a memory attached to a place. A hill might be said to cover a giant's body. A large stone might be one a giant threw. A ruined structure might be explained as something built by hands too large for ordinary people. The landscape becomes a kind of old book, with each unusual shape inviting a story. This is especially powerful in places where history, folklore, and geography overlap. People walk past the same rocks for generations. Children hear the same explanations. Names become attached to hills and valleys. Slowly, the giant settles into the land. And after enough time, It can feel as if the story was always there, sleeping quietly in the shape of the earth. One of the most famous giant stories connected to landscape is the tale of Fionn mac Cumhaill and the Giant's Causeway. The Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland is a real formation of interlocking basalt columns, created by ancient volcanic activity. But long before geology explained it, the stones invited another kind of explanation. They looked like a road, a path, or a bridge built by someone far larger than ordinary people. In legend, Fionn, sometimes anglicized as Finn MacCool, is linked to this strange stone pathway and to a rival giant across the sea in Scotland. The story has different versions, but the feeling remains the same. The rocks become evidence of a giant's movement, a giant's challenge, a giant's world touching our own. Geology can explain how basalt cools and cracks into columns. But folklore explains why human beings saw a path there and imagined footsteps large enough to cross the sea. Giants are often remembered as makers of paths. In old stories, they throw stones across valleys, build roads across impossible ground, shape causeways, carve out cliffs, or leave behind stepping stones from one land to another. Sometimes they are imagined carrying boulders in their aprons, dropping them by accident, or placing them with a purpose that later generations forgot. These stories often begin with a simple observation. A stone is too large. A path is too strange. An island seems too lonely. A line of rocks crosses a landscape in a way that feels almost deliberate. The human mind looks at these things and tries to complete the picture. A giant becomes the missing hand behind the scene. Modern geology can explain glaciers, lava flows, erosion, and shifting coastlines. But the older giant stories explain something different. They explain how those places felt to the people who lived beside them. A giant-made path is not only a path, it is the memory of scale, turned into a road across the unknown. Some places have long been known as giant graves, a mound, a long hill, a stone-covered ridge, or an unusually shaped rise in the land might be said to hold the body of an enormous being. Sometimes these stories grew around actual ancient burial mounds. Sometimes they formed around natural shapes that looked just enough like a body to invite belief. There is something strangely powerful about the idea of a giant grave. It takes a being too large for ordinary life and makes it still. The giant no longer walks, fights, builds, or threatens. It lies beneath grass, stone, and weather, slowly becoming part of the place itself. Local folklore often works this way. It attaches memory to land. A hill is no longer only a hill. It becomes a resting place, a warning, a landmark with a story folded into it. And whether or not a giant sleeps beneath the soil, the story changes how people see the ground under their feet. Some landscapes seem almost to invite the idea of a sleeping giant. A long ridge becomes a back. A rounded hill becomes a shoulder. Two slopes become folded knees. A distant mountain, seen at dusk, can look like a face turned toward the sky. The shape may only be coincidence, but the human mind is very good at finding bodies in the world. This is not foolish. It is part of how people notice patterns, remember places, and give meaning to the land around them. A sleeping giant in the hills makes the landscape feel watched over, or haunted, or quietly alive. It turns geography into presence. Hill figures and body-shaped landforms carry that same feeling. They suggest that something enormous is not gone, only resting. Not dead exactly, but hidden in the long patience of earth and grass. And maybe that is why sleeping giant images remain so strong. they make the land feel as if it has a secret breath. Islands are especially good at creating giant stories. An island is a world with edges. It has a clear boundary between the known and the unknown, between land and sea, between home and distance. For people living on islands, the horizon is always present. It surrounds daily life like a ring of mystery. That makes the imagination travel outward. What lies beyond the water? Who lives across the sea? What kind of being could step from one island to another, or build a causeway through the waves, or throw a stone from shore to shore? Giants fit naturally into that kind of thinking. They are large enough to cross what humans cannot. They can turn sea into path, cliff into doorway, island into footprint. This is why island folklore often feels so alive with enormous beings. The ocean makes ordinary distance feel magical. And a giant is the kind of figure who can make even the horizon seem reachable. In many traditions, giants feel like the old rulers of the land. They are not always described as kings with crowns or palaces. Sometimes their rule is older than that. They belong to the mountain before anyone names it. They guard the valley before borders are drawn. They shape the stones before roads are built. Their authority comes not from law, but from age, size, and memory. This idea appears again and again in different forms. The giant is often the one who was there first, before the village, before the castle, before the new gods, the new people, or the new stories arrived. Sometimes heroes defeat them. Sometimes saints drive them away. Sometimes they simply vanish, leaving only their names attached to places. To imagine giants as old rulers is to imagine the land as something inherited from powers no longer visible. The present becomes a thin layer over an older kingdom, one whose giants have mostly gone quiet. In South Asian traditions, giant-like beings often appear in forms that are not exactly the same as the giants of Europe. There are powerful classes of beings such as asuras and rakshasas, who are not simply tall humans, but figures of immense strength, appetite, magic, and opposition. In Hindu mythology, asuras are often described as powerful beings opposed to the devas, or gods, though the older meanings of the word were more complex. Rakshasas, meanwhile, appear as disruptive, shape-shifting beings in epic stories, with Ravana from the Ramayana as one of the most famous examples. What matters for the mystery of giants is not only physical size, but the feeling of scale. These beings are larger than ordinary life in power, presence, hunger, and danger. They belong to a world where gods, demons, heroes, forests, mountains, and cosmic order are all close together. Here again, the giant idea stretches beyond height. It becomes a way of imagining beings too powerful to fit comfortably inside the human world. Chinese legends also contain figures who feel giant-like, not only because of their size, but because of the scale of their actions. One of the most famous is Pangu, a primordial giant connected with the creation of the world. In the legend, Pangu emerges from a cosmic egg and separates heaven from earth, holding them apart as the world takes shape. Over time, his body becomes part of the universe itself, turning the giant into a kind of cosmic architecture. Wikipedia. Another giant figure is Quafu, who tries to chase the sun. In the story, his thirst becomes so enormous that he drinks from great rivers, yet still cannot reach what he pursues. Wikipedia. These stories show giants not as simple monsters, but as beings whose desires and actions are too large for ordinary life. One giant helps make the world. Another tries to follow the sun across it. In both cases, the giant becomes a measure of impossible scale. Around the world, giant stories often blend with stories of ancestors. In some traditions, the first people were imagined as larger, stronger, closer to the gods, or more deeply connected to the land than people living now. Over time, those ancestors could become enormous in memory. Not always giants in the monster sense, but founders, culture heroes, old rulers, or beings from an earlier age when the world itself seemed younger and more powerful. This idea appears in many forms. A people may remember that their ancestors shaped the land, crossed impossible distances, fought great beings, or left marks in stone, hills, rivers, and names. As generations pass, the difference between ancestor, hero, spirit, and giant can become soft at the edges. That softness is part of the mystery. Giants are often not entirely separate from humanity. Sometimes they are what humanity imagines behind itself. They are the larger figures in the rear of memory, standing where family history becomes legend. Mountains and forests have always been natural homes for giants. A mountain already feels like a giant body, still, heavy, old, and difficult to understand from close up. A forest, especially an old one, can feel inhabited even when no one is visible. Trees stand like columns. Shadows gather between trunks. Sounds travel strangely. A branch cracks somewhere in the distance, and the mind begins to imagine movement larger than itself. It is easy to see why people placed giant beings in such places. Mountains hide caves, storms, avalanches, and impossible distances. Forests hide animals, paths, darkness, and the sense of being watched. Both places make ordinary human size feel temporary. A mountain giant or forest giant is not just a creature living in nature. It is nature made almost human. A shape given to the feeling that the wild world is older than us, stronger than us, and never fully asleep. And then there are giants of the sea. Water creates a different kind of scale. A mountain can be seen, even if it cannot be moved. But the sea hides most of itself. It covers depth, darkness, movement, and life that rises only briefly before disappearing again. For people who lived by coasts or crossed open water, the ocean was not empty. It was a vast, unknown surface over something deeper. Stories of enormous beings beneath the water may come from many sources: whales, giant squid, storms, waves, shipwrecks, or the simple terror of not knowing what moved below. A shape seen once in rough water could grow larger in every retelling. A sound in the dark could become a voice. A wave could become a hand. Sea giants remind us that the unknown is not only beyond the mountains or in the past. Sometimes it is directly beneath us, moving quietly under the surface. Giant stories change depending on the land that carries them. In mountain regions, giants often become stone throwers, cave dwellers, or sleeping bodies hidden beneath ridges. In coastal places, they may become sea crossers, island makers, or beings who leave footprints near cliffs and tides. In forests, they become watchers among trees. In volcanic lands, they may be imagined beneath the earth, breathing fire or turning in their sleep. That flexibility is one reason giant stories survived so well. The idea of a giant is simple enough to travel, but large enough to absorb local details. Each place gives the giant a different body. A desert giant feels different from a forest giant. A sea giant feels different from a mountain giant. But all of them answer the same old feeling, that the landscape is too strange, too large, or too powerful to be completely empty. A giant is not only placed into a landscape. Often, the landscape seems to grow the giant itself. mammoth bones may have played a powerful role in ancient giant interpretations. Imagine finding a bone larger than any bone you have ever seen. A huge curved tusk, a massive leg bone, a tooth the size of a fist. Without modern paleontology, without museum reconstructions, without knowing about extinct Ice Age animals, such remains would have felt like messages from an earlier world. To us, mammoths belong to natural history. But to someone in the past, a mammoth bone could seem like proof that the earth once held creatures of impossible size. And if the bone looked even vaguely human, or if it was found in a place already surrounded by old stories, the imagination did not have far to travel. This does not mean ancient people were foolish. They were interpreting evidence with the knowledge available to them. A giant bone was not just an object. It was a question pulled from the ground, heavy, silent, and waiting for a story. Long before the word dinosaur existed, people were finding dinosaur bones. They did not know they were looking at animals from millions of years before humans. They did not have the idea of deep geological time in the modern scientific sense. A fossilized limb, rib, claw, or skull fragment could appear as the remains of a dragon, a giant, a monster, or some unknown being from a forgotten age. This is one reason old myths and fossil landscapes sometimes seem to speak to each other. The earth was giving people fragments of enormous creatures, but not the full picture. A few bones without context can invite almost any shape around them. Modern science eventually gave these remains names, dates, and evolutionary histories. But before that, they existed in the half-light between evidence and imagination. A dinosaur bone in an ancient landscape was not yet a museum specimen. It was a buried rumor of a world no living person had seen. Teeth and skulls are especially powerful objects for the imagination. A tooth tells you that something once bit, chewed, hunted, or fed. A skull suggests a face, even when the face is gone. When such remains are unusually large, broken, or unfamiliar, they can feel almost personal, as if the past is looking back through empty sockets. This is why misunderstood remains could so easily become part of giant stories. A large animal skull might be turned into the head of a giant. A fossil tooth might become the tooth of an ancient human-like being. A bone found alone, separated from the rest of its skeleton, could be placed into whatever story already lived nearby. The mind wants to complete what is missing. It does not like fragments to remain fragments, and so a skull becomes a face, a tooth becomes a mouth, a bone becomes a body. From a few pieces, the old world begins to stand up again. People once read fossils as stories because fossils arrived without explanation. They came from cliffs, riverbanks, caves, fields, and quarries. They appeared after storms, floods, landslides, or digging. They looked shaped, meaningful, and old. They were clearly not ordinary stones, but they were not living animals either. They belonged to a category that ancient people did not always have words for. So the fossil became a kind of message, a sign that something had happened before memory, something large, something strange, something that had left only pieces behind. In the modern world, we read fossils through science, anatomy, strata, dating, extinction, evolution. But older cultures read them through story, because story was one of the main tools humans had for organizing mystery. A fossil was not just evidence, it was an invitation. And when the evidence was enormous, the story that grew around it often became enormous too. When modern science began to understand fossils more carefully, the meaning of giant bones changed. A huge bone was no longer only a mystery from the ground. It could be compared, measured, classified, and placed into a larger history of life. What once might have seemed like the thigh bone of a giant could become the leg bone of a mammoth. What might have seemed like the skull of a monster could become the remains of an extinct animal. The strange object did not become less wonderful. It became wonderful in a different way. Science gave fossils names, ages, and relationships. It showed that the Earth was far older than many people had imagined, and that entire worlds of animals had appeared and disappeared long before human memory began. In one sense, science took some giant stories apart, but in another sense, it made the world even larger. The bones were not proof of giant people, perhaps, but they were proof that the past had truly been enormous. Old fossil interpretations still fascinate us because they sit between two ways of understanding the world. On one side, there is the old imagination, a bone pulled from the earth, a strange skull found in a cave, a giant tooth kept as a relic, a story forming around something no one can fully explain. On the other side, there is modern science, careful measurement, comparison, anatomy, geology, extinction, and deep time. Both ways of seeing are human. One tries to explain with story, the other tries to explain with evidence, and sometimes, looking back, we can understand why the older stories felt so convincing. A mammoth bone really is enormous. A fossil skull really can look like a face from another world. A dinosaur remain really does seem almost impossible when first uncovered. The old explanations may not have been scientifically correct, but they were responses to real wonder. And that wonder has not disappeared. It has only changed its language. There's a difference between evidence and imagination, but the two have often lived very close together. Evidence is the thing itself, the bone, the footprint, the stone, the measurement, the place. Imagination is the story that grows around it. When evidence is incomplete, imagination often tries to finish the shape. A single bone does not tell its whole story. A ruin does not explain who built it simply by standing there. A footprint, if it is strange enough, becomes more than a mark in the ground. It becomes a question. This is why giant stories can be so difficult to untangle. Some began with pure myth. Some may have grown from misunderstood evidence. Some were symbolic. Some were religious. Some were shaped by fear, landscape, memory, and exaggeration all at once. The mistake is to treat every old story as either fact or foolishness. Often, it is something more delicate, evidence and imagination meeting in the dark, each one giving the other a voice. Sometimes, the giant body was not mythical at all, but human biology stretched to its rare extremes. Gigantism is a medical condition that can occur when the body produces too much growth hormone during childhood before the growth plates in the bones have closed. Acromegaly is related, but usually begins in adulthood, changing the face, hands, feet, and bones after ordinary growth has ended. These conditions are rare, but when they occur, they can make a person look strikingly different from those around them. Today, we understand these conditions through medicine. But in earlier times, before hormones, glands, and medical imaging were known, a person of extraordinary height could easily seem touched by something beyond ordinary life. They might inspire awe, fear, pity, admiration, or legend. Their body would be real, but the meanings placed upon it could grow far beyond biology. In that space, the line between person and giant could become very thin. some of the tallest recorded humans remind us how far the human body can sometimes reach. The most famous is Robert Wadlow, often listed as the tallest reliably measured person in modern history. He reached a height of 8 feet 11.1 inches, or about 2.72 meters. Even in photographs, surrounded by ordinary-sized people, he seems almost unreal, as if a myth had briefly stepped into the modern world wearing a suit and shoes. But stories of extremely tall people are not only about measurements, they are about presence. A person far taller than everyone around them changes the feeling of a room. They make ordinary objects look small. Doorways, chairs, beds, and clothing all become reminders that the world is built for average bodies. For ancient people, seeing someone unusually tall may have carried even more emotional force. A rare human body can become a living doorway between the ordinary and the legendary. And once remembered, it may grow taller still in the telling. Rare height becomes legend, because memory does not preserve people like a measuring tape. It preserves impressions. A person who was unusually tall might be remembered not as 6 feet, or 7 feet, or 8 feet, but as towering, enormous, larger than any man anyone had seen before. And once that memory passes from one speaker to another, it can begin to grow. The tall warrior becomes a giant warrior. The giant warrior becomes a being from an older age. The older age becomes a world where people were stronger, stranger, and closer to myth. This is not always dishonesty. It is how oral memory often works. It keeps the feeling of an event, sometimes more strongly than the exact measurement. If someone made others feel small, the story may remember them as larger than life. And when enough time passes, larger than life can become almost literal. The body disappears, the feeling remains, and the feeling keeps growing in the dark. Ancient warriors were often remembered through exaggeration. In battle stories, size becomes a kind of language. A powerful enemy is called huge. A feared champion becomes towering. A king with great strength becomes almost superhuman. The point is not always to give an exact physical description. Sometimes the point is to make the listener feel what the storyteller felt: danger, awe, dread, and impossible odds. This is why warriors and giants often overlap. A giant can represent the enemy who seems unbeatable before the fight begins. He is not only large in body, he is large in reputation, large in fear, large in the imagination of those who must face him. Over time, the details of the battlefield fade, but the image of the enormous opponent remains, and perhaps that is how some warrior stories grew into giant stories. Not because every giant was once a real man, but because fear has always known how to add height. Fear makes enemies larger. This is true even now, in ordinary life. A problem can seem bigger before we face it. A stranger can seem more threatening from a distance. A shadow in the dark can grow into something the daylight would make smaller. In ancient stories, this feeling becomes physical. The enemy is not only dangerous, he is enormous. His city walls are higher. His weapons are heavier, his footsteps are louder, his people are stronger. The land itself seems guarded by bodies too large to overcome. This kind of storytelling gives fear a visible shape. It lets a community speak about anxiety without naming it directly. The giant becomes the size of the challenge ahead. And yet, these stories often also contain a hidden comfort. If fear can become a giant, then courage can become the small figure that stands before it. The giant shows how large fear feels. The hero shows that feeling is not always fate. stories grow as they travel. A tale told once beside a fire may be repeated in another village, then another, then another. Each teller remembers some details, forgets others, and adds a little color of their own. A hill becomes higher, a stone becomes heavier, a warrior becomes taller, a footprint becomes deeper, a strange bone becomes more human with every retelling. This is not a flaw in storytelling, it is part of its life. Stories are not stones locked in place. They are living things. They adapt to the listener, to the place, to the needs of the moment. A story told to warn children may grow darker. A story told to honor ancestors may grow grander. A story told beside ruins may become older than anyone can prove. That is how giants survive so well. They are easy for stories to carry. They can grow without breaking. In fact, growing is what they do best. There's a thin line between unusually tall humans and mythical giants. On one side of the line, there are real bodies. Rare, visible, measurable, human. People who lived, suffered, worked, traveled, and were seen by others. Their height may have brought attention, difficulty, admiration, or loneliness, but they remained people. On the other side, there are beings of mountain, storm, sacred memory, and impossible scale. Giants who shape landscapes, fight gods, build causeways, or sleep beneath hills. These figures belong to story, symbol, and imagination. But between those two sides, there is a misty border. A very tall person can inspire legend. A legend can be given human details. A giant can seem more believable when the world has already shown that some human bodies can grow far beyond expectation. The mystery lives in that borderland. Not because it proves one side or the other, but because it shows how easily human reality and human imagination can stand close together. Giants often become symbols of chaos. Not chaos as simple noise or confusion, but chaos as the old disorder beneath the surface of the world. The force before walls, before laws, before names, before safe roads and settled fields. A giant is large enough to break the shape of ordinary life. It can step across boundaries, ignore gates, overturn houses, and move through places where humans have carefully arranged their fragile order. That is why giants so often appear in stories where the world is not yet stable. They belong to beginnings, endings, battles, floods, storms, and wild lands. Their bodies seem to carry the memory of a time when everything was still too large, too raw, too unfinished. And yet, chaos is not always meaningless. Sometimes it is the material from which order is made. A giant may threaten the world, but it may also reveal what the world is built against. It shows the shape of the boundary by standing just beyond it. Giants are also symbols of nature. A giant's body often feels like a landscape. Its bones become mountains. Its breath becomes wind. Its anger becomes thunder. Its footsteps become valleys. Its sleeping shape becomes a hill seen from far away. This connection appears so often because nature itself is the first giant humans ever knew. Long before people imagined enormous beings, they already lived beneath enormous forces. Mountains, forests, oceans, storms, seasons, droughts, and earthquakes were all larger than human intention. They could nourish, shelter, frighten, or destroy without needing to explain themselves. To imagine these forces as giants was to make them almost understandable. A storm with a face can be feared in a different way than a storm without one. A mountain that sleeps can be spoken about as if it listens. The giant gives nature a body close enough to recognize, but still too large to command. Giants can represent old power. Not the quick power of a weapon or the temporary power of a king, but the heavy power of something that has been there for longer than anyone remembers. The power of stone, the power of ancestry, the power of a place whose stories began before written records, the power of a name that people keep saying even after they have forgotten where it came from. This is why giants often feel older than heroes. A hero usually enters a story to do something. A giant often seems to have been there already, waiting in the mountain, sleeping beneath the hill, guarding the pass, holding the old boundary, existing before the latest kingdom rose and after it disappears. That kind of power does not need to move quickly. It is powerful because it remains. The giant is the shape of old strength, slow and difficult to erase, resting beneath the newer layers of the world. Giants often stand for the fear of the unknown. They live where maps end, where forests deepen, where mountains hide their far sides, where the sea turns dark, and where old stories begin to speak more loudly than facts. In that way, the giant is not only a being, it is the thing the mind places in empty space before knowledge arrives. The unknown has always needed shapes. Without a shape, it is too wide, too vague, too difficult to speak about. A giant gives it form. A person can say there is something beyond the ridge, something in the cave, something under the hill, something large enough to explain the sounds, the shadows, the bones, or the fear. And once the unknown has a body, people can tell stories about it. They can warn one another. They can imagine meeting it. They can imagine surviving it. The giant makes the unknown visible, even when it remains far away. Giants are remembered as builders because building is one of the most human things they do. A giant who builds is not simply wild. It has intention. It understands weight, distance, shape, and purpose. It can carry stones too heavy for ordinary hands, set them into walls, bridge seas, raise towers, or leave behind structures that seem to belong to a scale larger than daily life. This is one reason giant builder stories feel different from stories of giant destroyers. They are less about fear and more about wonder. They ask not, what could break this place, but who could have made it? When people looked at old stones and strange ruins, they often felt the presence of labor without knowing the workers. Giant builders filled that absence with bodies large enough for the task. Modern knowledge can name tools, techniques, cultures, and dates. But the older question still has its beauty. When something enormous stands silently in the landscape, it is natural to imagine enormous hands behind it. Giants as builders appear in stories all over the world because building is one of the few giant acts that feels almost peaceful. A giant who destroys is easy to imagine. A being that large could crush, break, trample, and tear apart. But a giant who builds is more interesting. It suggests patience, purpose, memory, a mind behind the strength, hands large enough to move stones but careful enough to place them. This is why old walls, stone circles, causeways, towers, lonely boulders, and strange ruins so often gathered giant stories around them. When people saw something that seemed too heavy, too old, or too perfectly placed, they imagined builders who were not like ordinary people. A giant builder turns mystery into craftsmanship. The impossible stone is not random anymore. It has been carried, chosen, set down, left behind. And even when modern archaeology gives us better answers, the old feeling remains. Some places still seem to ask for larger hands, deeper time, and builders who vanished before anyone wrote their names. Giants as destroyers are easier to fear. In many stories, A giant does not carefully place stones. It throws them. It breaks walls. It tears up trees. It floods valleys, smashes homes, or leaves behind marks of violence in the land. A fallen cliff, a scattered field of boulders, a broken ridge, or a shattered ruin can become the memory of an enormous anger. Destruction gives the giant movement. It makes the landscape feel as if something once passed through with force too great to resist. Where the builder leaves order, the destroyer leaves evidence of disorder. Stones do not sit quietly because they were arranged. They lie scattered because something huge disturbed them. This is another way people made sense of the world's rough edges. Not every strange place looks built. Some places look wounded, and when the land looked broken, the imagination sometimes placed a giant nearby. Not always as a monster, but as the shape of a force strong enough to leave the earth changed behind it. Giants, as protectors, carry a different kind of power. They are large, but not necessarily threatening. They stand at borders, guard valleys, watch over treasures, defend hidden places, or sleep beneath hills like old guardians waiting for a time of need. Their size becomes shelter rather than danger. This idea appears in many forms because protection itself often feels large. A wall protects by being bigger than the threat. A mountain protects by standing between one place and another. A forest can hide a village. A cliff can guard a coast. So when people imagined protective giants, they were giving a human shape to the feeling of being shielded by something greater than themselves. A protective giant does not need to move quickly. It can simply be there, watching, waiting, remembering. Its strength is in its presence, and perhaps that is why the image feels so calm. A giant at rest is still a giant. Even asleep, it carries the possibility of protection. Giants can also be memories of childhood when adults seemed enormous. Every human being begins life in a world of giants. Parents, strangers, older siblings, teachers, and neighbors all tower above us at first. Their hands are large. Their voices fill rooms. Their decisions shape the small world around us. Before we understand height, power, or distance, we understand what it feels like to look upward. Maybe some part of that feeling stays with us. The giant in myth may echo the oldest human experience of scale. Being small among beings who seem impossibly large, powerful, and mysterious. This does not mean giant stories are only childhood memories. They are much older and wider than that. But the emotional shape is familiar to everyone. To be human is to have once lived among larger figures whose moods, movements, and choices mattered deeply. Perhaps giants endure because they remind us of that first view of the world, when every doorway was high, every chair was a mountain, and every adult seemed to belong to a larger race. Giant stories survived into modern times because they are simple, flexible, and emotionally strong. A giant does not require a complicated explanation to be understood. Everyone knows what it means for something human-shaped to become enormous. Everyone understands the feeling of standing before something too large. That simplicity allows the idea to travel across languages, religions, landscapes, and centuries. But giants are also flexible. They can be monsters, ancestors, builders, warriors, protectors, symbols of nature, signs of chaos, or memories of an older world. They can belong in sacred texts, fairy tales, mountain legends, fantasy novels, films, games, and internet rumors. The shape changes, but the feeling remains. Modern life has measured much of the world, but measurement has not removed wonder. We still imagine enormous beings because they give size to questions that are hard to answer. What came before us? What lies beyond us? What is hidden under the ground, behind the mountain, or deep in memory? The giant remains because those questions remain. And now, as the old stories begin to soften, you can let the details slowly fade. We have wandered through the long mystery of giants, through sacred texts and mountain legends, through strange bones and old ruins, through sleeping hills, distant islands, stormy seas, and worlds where the past seemed larger than the present. Some giants were feared, some were honored, some built paths across impossible places, some guarded valleys, shaped landscapes, fought gods, or vanished into the far edges of memory. And some may have been born from something very human, the need to explain what felt too large, too old, or too powerful to understand. We do not need to decide everything tonight. We do not need to know exactly where every story began, or why every culture imagined beings greater than ordinary people. It is enough for now to notice that the image remained, a huge figure standing in the midst of human memory, half symbol, half shadow, part fear, part wonder, part warning, part dream. Perhaps giants were never only about size. Perhaps they were about the feeling that the world is deeper than it looks, that the land beneath our feet has carried older stories, that mountains, stones, bones, and names can hold echoes long after the people who first spoke them have gone quiet. And maybe that is why the mystery still stays with us, because somewhere inside the idea of a giant, there's the feeling of being small beneath a vast sky, listening to the dark and wondering what came before. So now, you can let the stories rest, let the names drift away, let the stones sink back into the hills, let the old bones return to the earth, let the distant figures fade into mist, where they can remain half seen and peaceful. There is nothing more you need to follow. The night can hold the rest. And if you are still awake, you can simply stay here a little longer, breathing quietly while the world grows soft around you. Sleep well and dream gently.